I'll throw that in as a little Easter egg in the links. So please click on the link to find out more about that if you don't know about that little episode from history. But it does really raise the question of the types of corruption that go on in the Vatican that we know about and has been uncovered time and time again through papacy after papacy, and absolutely, seemingly with no exception in the modern era. So again, we can't exactly lay this at the feet of Pope Francis. I mean, who knows to what extent who was involved in this or what it was. My initial thought on seeing the headline to this story is, it must have been some sort of prankster or something, but I don't think pranksters send 40,000 euros of cocaine on just as a joke. So this is obviously something that was going on, coordinated obviously with someone inside who obviously was tipped off, so the sting didn't end up catching him. But again, it just raises the specter of the corruption that goes to the core of the Vatican, and that haunted Benedict before Francis as well. And in fact, it brings to my mind the story of Benedict's retirement, that whole bizarre story that still I don't think has ever been fully explained, but it did bring up to my mind an interesting article from March of 2010, I believe. Papal aide, Vatican singer fired over alleged gay prostitute ring that apparently was operating there in the Vatican. So again, it just corruption after corruption after corruption, and it just doesn't seem to stop. And this is the most holy, revered institution in the world, or so they want you to believe. And unfortunately, the rot is right there at the top.
James, I'll include a couple of other relateds. 2 articles I put into one tweet. Drug cartels rely on big banks to launder profits. And at the border, the drugs go north and the cash goes south. Interestingly enough, both these articles, one comes from NPR, the other comes from OPB, Oregon Public Broadcasting, and they both talk about how the Sinaloa cartel runs their money through banks such as HSBC, and the article goes through so many other things. You might have heard of the Sinaloa cartel in the news lately because they've busted one of its latest leaders, that's El Chapo Guzman. And the last related, James, I'll throw in is a flashback to June of 1999, when the head of the New York Stock Exchange, Richard Grasso, met with the Colombian FARC rebels and said, "You guys have got a lot of money. You should invest it in the New York Stock Exchange." James, any comment about those before we move to our third and final segment this week?
Not really. Just to say business as usual in the New World Order.
So we've had the sex, we've had the drugs, and now we have not the rock and roll, but the resources. Sanctions against Russia? Well, don't tell ExxonMobil. This from the always interesting allgov.com. Imposing sanctions against Russia for its takeover of Crimea would not sit well with ExxonMobil, the United States' largest oil corporation. Now, ExxonMobil may be based in the United States, but that doesn't mean it's an American company, not in the sense that its interests and those of the nation coincide. Sometimes they might have shared interests, but in the case of Russia's power play in the Ukraine, ExxonMobil has far too much invested in America's former Cold War nemesis to see the U.S. government, led by President Barack Obama, get in its way of making money. While the White House searches for ways to punish Putin for annexing Crimea, it's business as usual, just as you said, James, for ExxonMobil inside Russia. 2 years ago, the American oil giant signed a lucrative deal with Rosneft, Russia's petrochemical behemoth, to jointly explore offshore oil and gas in the Kara Sea in the Arctic Ocean and the Black Sea, where the Crimean Peninsula is. As part of this agreement, Rosneft acquired a 30% stake in 20 ExxonMobil offshore oil and gas exploration blocks in the Gulf of Mexico. This arrangement has not been compromised by the Ukraine crisis. And James, as long as we're talking about oil, I think it's interesting to note, and sad and disgusting and infuriating, oil spill shuts down a Houston ship channel right on the 25th anniversary of the Exxon Valdez spill. And even more recently, BP spills unknown amount of tar sands into Lake Michigan, and that story is still developing. James?
Well, exactly right. That is a particularly sad irony there. But on the note of Russia and the sanctions, for anyone who's been reading the International Forecaster, I have been writing about this for weeks now. I think that these sanctions are all hot air. That's why we've only seen bark and definitely no bite so far with the sanctions. And I don't think we're likely to see any, precisely because of this, because of the interlocking nature of the multinationals that bear no allegiance to the United States or any particular country and are operating in Russia, so they don't want their interests messed with, and they won't be, trust me. They will not be messed with by these sanctions one way or another. So it's all smoke and mirrors being played out right now, and I think that this just feeds into the larger global agenda, which, as that article does point out, has nothing to do with multinational corporations being beholden to U.S. interests or any other national interests. They are only beholden to their corporate owners. And of course, what is ExxonMobil other than one of the seven sisters of Rockefeller, the Rockefeller dynasty? So we know who's really puppeteering this from behind the scenes. And of course, this leads into the specter of the new Cold War. Meet the new Cold War, same as the old Cold War, which, as we know from people like Anthony Sutton, was provided completely by support, technological and otherwise, military, financial, from the West. And that's how it was built up. And that is exactly what is happening now, as you're about to reveal in a related story. And as Anthony Sutton also talked about in his work, he even predicted back in the 1990s when he was writing, or 1980s, when he was writing in, for example, America's Secret Establishment, he predicted that China would become one of the world's leading economies by the year 2000. He said, well, switch that with 2010, and we're pretty much there, based on the interlocking deals and contracts that are made with multinational corporations from the West with China. And he was seeing it there taking place in the build-up to the Chinese behemoth, with some of the contracts that were being signed in the latter part of the 20th century, but they're continuing, and not only China, but Russia. So once again, the whole Cold War mentality that's being built up right now is all smoke and mirrors.
And I think to drive that home even more, great related from Blacklisted News and Judicial Watch, U.S. gives Russia free military equipment. The secret operation was exposed this past week by members of the U.S. Congress that discovered it going through the 2014 budget and the 2015 budget proposals. And again, all the smoke and mirrors in the show and the sanctions will not affect really any of this. James, I think in a way, this is, I think, from the earliest planning of it, should show that all of the revered institutions, from the churches to the banks to your so-called elected officials, are completely effed. They're all completely lawless criminals, and they should be treated and regarded as such. So having said that, I'll just quickly mention a couple of our updates and a couple of stories submitted via Twitter, #NewWorldNextWeek. Abu Ghaith, Osama's son-in-law, has been convicted in his terror trial. We covered that story in full for a few weeks ago for you here on New World Next Week. And a couple of stories submitted to us, which you can do on Twitter using #NewWorldNextWeek. Again, an update on the ongoing saga of the Flight 370 out of Malaysia, gets into AWACS, hijacking, sabotage, and propaganda. And I'll also note I actually just did an interview with Niall Bowie, who is based in Malaysia, RT reporter. And we talked about, in addition to Ukraine and China and Japan, we talked about Malaysia and Flight 370. Another interesting one from @Mamik, spyware app turns the privacy tables on Google Glass wearers. And finally, YouTube enlists trusted flaggers to police videos. And James, I think as we close this, we'll throw that out to the audience to say, don't let that happen.
Well, that's the point. And I was just listening to your interview with Niall Bowie today, so I will recommend that. It was a good conversation. And unfortunately, we had a rather somber conversation today about business as usual in the New World Order and the corruption of every institution imaginable. So hopefully next week we can have a more upbeat conversation, hopefully with some positive news stories. On that note, please submit your positive news stories ideas. Once again, #NewWorldNextWeek, or email James or myself, and we'll be happy to include that next week. So on that note, James, thank you again for your time.
Thanks so much.